but that's not proficient. So we want it to be like these, proficiency to be within 1 to 2 seconds. So when you're also choosing phonological awareness tests, because we might all use different things in different districts, make sure that there's some manipulation involved in that test to kind of, as I said, separate, you know, our really strong, well, our real proficient from our kids who are maybe aware or unaware. Okay, so letter sound skills, when we talk about those tonight, it's knowledge of letters, sounds, but not just, you know, individual. Children need to be aware of blends, digraphs, diphthongs, and it is diff with a PH. I have had many graduate students think it's a diphthong. And variations, vowel teams, and all of those things. We're going to talk about phonic decoding, using that letter sound knowledge and phonological blending to sound out unfamiliar words. We're going to talk about phonics in terms of it being an instructional approach, and also how letters and letter patterns represent sounds while reading and spelling. So as it says here, number 1 and 2 are essential for reading and an alphabet-based written language. Item 3 assures us that students will develop items 1 and 2. Non-explicit and non-systematic approaches to 1 and 2 do not work with at-risk students. I've done it. You know, I've sat there with the book and tried to help them through a book that they really weren't ready to read because they didn't understand the sounds, and I'm like, well, read to the period, go back, use the first sound, make a good guess, and here's the one I cringe over. Look at the picture. Because I said it, and I said it for probably way too long, but that was the training that I had at that time. We don't want kids to match, look at the picture and then think the word has to match. We want them to read the words and then look at the picture and say, oh yeah, that shows. I mean, you're putting it together, yes, that's part of comprehension, but we want kids to be able to lift those words off the page the same way we lift words off the page as readers. Good readers don't look at pictures. Good readers don't have pictures in their books. All right, unless you're reading a magazine. Okay, so we really want to encourage like getting right into the words. So this kind of leads us into this simple view of reading that I mentioned earlier. So our goal is always reading comprehension. As Maria said, you know, we spend a lot of time on talking about how to lift the word off the page, but never without thinking that our goal is comprehension and getting kids into text. That's our goal always. But if a child is struggling with reading comprehension, there's usually 2 things going on. So let's go, like, we're going to backtrack here. They might be having trouble with automatic word recognition, lack of fluency. I mean, how many people have sat at meetings, and we call them IST meetings, where we'll say, oh, they have a fluency problem. Let's work on fluency. Well, they probably don't have a fluency problem if they can talk fluently. What they probably have, if you back up, is a decoding problem. They can't figure out what those words are because they don't know what the sounds are that those letters represent. And if they have a decoding problem, they might have a letter sound proficiency problem. That phonics piece is just not happening for them yet, or certain parts of it. And we'll talk about that as we talk about assessment. Or they may have some phonemic difficulties, like just not being able to like break apart those sounds and recognize that those are sounds in our language. So we have to, if there's a decoding issue, we don't just stop at the decoding issue. We want to back up and see, is there a problem with their phonological awareness? Do some assessment there, little diagnostics. Is there a problem with their letter sound proficiency? And look into that also. However, if you look across the bottom here with reading comprehension, there are children who are able to read that have language comprehension issues. It's unusual, but I have had a few kids along the way who can read 5th grade girl a couple of years ago, she could read 129 words a minute and it sounded good. And then we would say, who are the characters in the story? And she would look at us like, characters? There were characters? But that is actually, I will say, rare. That is really unusual. And we might say those kids are maybe like hyperlexic. Is that the correct term? I'm looking for any psychologist in here. All right, so that does happen. But more than likely, there might be comprehension problems because the child has got some maybe lack of background knowledge in the topic. The knowledge of text and sentence structures is a little off. They're not using the punctuation correctly. Vocabulary knowledge, man, we see kids with that all the time. I remember a few years back, my TA went crazy because she had kids in 3rd grade who didn't know what a sleeve was. Nobody could give her a definition of a sleeve. These kinds of things happen, and that's all part of the piece. So we're not saying that this isn't as important, it all fits together to get reading comprehension, but we know as teachers, as educators, even if kids have vocabulary knowledge, because I've had them, and they have great background knowledge, and they've had all these worldly experiences, if they can't lift the word off the page, they aren't going to be able to comprehend. So this is what we're dealing with, is just figuring out the child. So the part of the reader in that we're going to talk about tonight is the top section of this and what we do about that. But we're not ignoring the bottom part. That's, of course, how many people here are working with children who are ESL or ENL students? Okay, so the things that we're going to talk about will apply to them, but of course we recognize that bottom piece too. Very important. Kind of like I can read a page in Spanish. I am certified in Spanish, but when I get to the end of the page, I've been so busy trying to think of the translations of a few of the words I get stuck on that my comprehension's gone. So it's that way, I'm sure, for a lot of those kids. So part 2, decoding, 2 definitions, a broad definition and a narrow one. The broad one is that word reading in general versus comprehension, regardless of whether the words are familiar or unfamiliar. We're decoding words, that's broad. The narrow definition is really figuring out unfamiliar words, typically via letter sound conversion process. This is the more common definition that we use in educational context when we talk about decoding.